Okay, everybody, welcome back to the Metal Mastermind.
Episode number 2, man.
That's right, man.
This is awesome,
Episode number
dude.
2. This is
I
great.
love it. I love it. Yeah.
I'm so excited to come back today. This is going to be a really juicy episode for everybody. Jason, what are we talking about today?
Dude, we are going to cover some vintage recording techniques and talk a little bit about that, but we're also going to somewhat compare that to some of the modern recording techniques as well. And we're going to go pretty deep into this, guy. So there's going to be some things that maybe you haven't heard of before in this episode, and we're going to talk about those. And then we've got some juicy little tips at the end of this episode. So make sure you stay tuned for the entire episode. But real quick, before we get started here, please give this video a like, a thumbs up. That really helps our channel. And like I said, we want to help as many musicians as we possibly can.
Yeah, we're passionate about this kind of stuff. I'm sure as many of you are. We're musicians ourselves. I'm Ken. Jason, of course. We've been in the game for a little while now, and
A little while.
we've we've learned a couple things along the way. Despite our age difference, we're very in sync with this kind of stuff. So we want to share that with you today. And talking about vintage versus modern styles of recording, very, very popular question to ask as to what should I get, what's a better investment into my studio, or I just want to go out and play live. What do I really need? There's a lot of stuff to do, and there's a lot of things out there. Of course, there's an entire industry for that. But we're just gonna kind of hone in on a couple of things why we loved some of our own favorite records, why they sounded the way they did, what were the limitations, what were the advancements, and then of course how to kind of emulate that in our own stuff. I'm a big fan of digital recording. Growing up in the digital age is just kind of been a part of my life. So, Jason, I know you've had a lot more experience of, seeing what it was like before then and then coming up to where it is now. And what's the stark difference between the two?
Like in my opinion, and I'm gonna keep this in layman's terms. What the main difference I hear, there's two things. So one of the main differences in a lot of the vintage albums, vintage recordings, the bass guitar and the kick drum and the drums in general aren't as polished or prevalent. And whereas in modern day recording, it's funny because you and I didn't even talk about this part, and it's just popped in my head. When we we're talking earlier this week, the modern man, you can hear everything, so that's an awesome thing. Now, on the flip side, with a lot of the modern stuff, what I'm finding is there's a tendency for it to, especially in metal music, for it to all sound the same. It's like you're listening to a metal band, and track 1 sounds like track 3 and track 5, and you get to track 9, you're like, wait a minute, I think I heard this twice already. And then even among other metal bands, it's like there's this, I don't know, there's this trend where all metal was starting to sound the same. And back with the vintage recording styles, because the techniques were the way they were, your bands, there was a big contrast, like even Metallica, Megadeth, and we'll get into some bands later. But think of the differences in the recordings of, let's say, Master of Puppets and Peace Cells,
Oh my
recorded
God.
around the same time. Major difference though, dude. So you had more of an individual sound. So that's kind of my take. That's kind of what I get from that.
I mean, you make a great point as to how modern is so much cleaner in the style of recording. A lot of the things that we're talking about when we get back into the vintage vibe of things, part of that sound was the dirtiness.
Yeah.
And we loved hearing Black Sabbath and Priest. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
back in that day, it has a vibe, you know, and you start getting into the 80s, and that's where things really started to change. We can call it the golden age of rock and roll and all that stuff, where you have,
Yeah.
everybody's like, snorting coke at the time, but it's also been reflected. It's
It
also
was
been
vintage Coke.
it's vintage coke. It's also been reflected in how it was recorded. For example, let me pick out an album over here.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of King Diamond, right? Grandma, that we got all that.
Oh, dude, yes. Yes.
Well, the King is he's got a lot of wonderful palettes of color in his albums, and Andy Rourke, the guitar player, what an amazing fellow here, man. He's actually also the mastering engineer for a lot of King Diamonds. If nobody knows what a mastering engineer is, that's the last chain of the recording process. So you have the recording engineer, it gets mixed, and then you have the mastering engineer to finalize that production, so it goes also to distribution. But, Andy Rourke was involved with that last process, which is very rare for, especially back in that day where you had an instrumentalist like him and a musician to perform on the album and also take care of the mastering. It wasn't very common, I mean, going even further back than that, man, we're talking like engineers, they had a role, and there was always like an assembly line chain going from one place to another. It was like record companies, they weren't shy about spending money where they needed to do it. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And listening to King Diamond, talking about like snorting coke, man, those those guys had so much high frequency energy in their mixes, and I'll tell you, man, it's like I think it's got something to do with that, because there's like a sense of like more, and they just amplify those frequencies up there. It's really, really kind of funny. You listen to it, it's like, wow, there's like a whole bunch of high end, but there's no bass.
What a great album, though, dude. Like you mentioned
yeah.
that last week, and I actually, Ken and I talked earlier this week about this episode. We like to, meet several times, because our big thing is to give you guys like a buttload of value, so I hope we're doing that. But we're talking about bands, and dude, I went back and listened to that album. I was working on the patio, just writing a blog post, and I just had that playing, and I'm like, holy crap, dude. And then I started listening to interviews with him on YouTube and stuff like that.
Oh, he's a kooky
about
guy.
Some of the yeah, it was crazy, dude. But it was like, wow, you talked about the energy. That album has so much energy. There's a raw feeling to that. There's like, hey, we're here. We don't give a crap what anybody thinks about what we're doing. We're just going to do what we do and blast it in your face. And dude, you just like, I get it. I get how Abigail, that specific album, and King Diamond and these other bands from that era, I get how you can kind of be cultish about those albums and be obsessed with them.
Absolutely. And man, like moving from like, King Diamond, going even further back, and I mentioned Judas Priest, like the differences between Diamond and Priest, I mean, we're talking Abigail came out in 87. Let's
87.
Let's go back to, 76, almost 10 years ago, 11 years ago, right? This difference in recording technology, man, is like completely out of this world. Everything sounded so much more like raw, organic, almost in a way kind of, I want to say dull, because it wasn't so enhanced, right? It wasn't like where they didn't know what metal was supposed to sound like at the time, right? They just they had a vibe. They captured it the way they did. They knew, the recording engineers in the 70s, a lot of that was borrowing from information just from the 60s and the 50s, and recording technology, it was still in its infancy, man. I mean, like, we're not quite as the infancy as in the time of like Thomas Edison, right? Then, nobody knew what the hell even recording was. But, going forward, it's like, you start getting into like the Roaring Twenties and the 1930s, where we started to see a lot more of that development happen, and ribbon microphones were created and dynamic microphones were created,
The
and
ribbons,
this
yes.
and this technology was pretty much either sent straight to tape, or it was sent straight to vinyl. Initially it was actually just sent straight to vinyl. They would record on they would record in a room where they had a horn. A horn was the microphone, and it would
Dude.
point. It would point at the subject, and it would essentially it would take the sound vibrations and it would etch into the record. That's how they used to do it. And you can't go back. Obviously, you can't re-record. You just, once you did it, you had maybe, I think you had only about like 4 minutes of recording time on each one of those records. Crazy,
Wow.
crazy.
No post production then,
No
right? No
post-production.
post mixing or production.
No.
You had to play it right there live,
Yep.
and you better be on point. Whereas nowadays, Ken, I can go record a guitar solo in my studio, and it's no joke that I'll record probably 100 guitar solos for one little section before I'm happy with it. You couldn't do that back then,
Yeah. No, you
you know.
literally had to adjust the spacing between
Yeah,
musicians. That was mixing. That was
that was
mixing.
it.
And
Mixing on the go.
going back to like Priest, you hear that information, and how like it's so like the stereo image is so much like just wider, like the
Yeah.
guitars are just like they're super wide. They just that's the thing about like analog versus digital. People are always asking, what is the difference between analog and digital? And one of the biggest differences, man, is that analog equipment, you're actually passing through electrical circuitry, and by doing that, you're allowing the circuitry to be true to where it needs to be in the stereo field. So you actually get bigger sounding mixes from doing that. You have a wider image. It's not so enclosed like it is what we call it in the box, which is just mixing in the computer. And
Yeah.
a lot of that's a big technique that a lot of mix engineers do nowadays, is that they mix in the box, but then they run through what we call a summing mixer, which takes all those inputs and outputs, and they send it into like a 2-track, and you just record that, and you get a little bit of the analog circuitry, but you still mixed it primarily in the box. So it's kind of like a mix of both worlds in that way. Kind of really cool. But lots of tips and tricks into doing this sort of thing. Now, what's another album? You mentioned Master of Puppets. Tell me about Master of
Yeah.
Puppets, man.
The thing about Master of Puppets, of course, I consider that vintage. That was 1986, so I assume it
Hmm.
was probably recorded like in '85 or something like that. What you can tell, they're still doing the old school technique of they're miking their amps,
Oh,
but
yeah.
not using a lot of prestigious equipment. I think I think he had a modded Mesa, if I'm not mistaken, like a Mark 2C or 2C, something like that. They were miking it, and Puppets was is funny because me being a huge old Metallica fan, let me emphasize old Metallica. Um, there's a huge difference between their prior album, Ride the Lightning, and Master of Puppets. I thought Master of Puppets was, I don't want to say it was better recording or better production quality. I'll say it's probably better recording quality. Better, they recorded their instruments and mic'd their instruments a little bit better than they did in the prior years. But it still had this raw vibe. The distortion of the guitars were nothing like what you hear in today's metal music. They weren't as polished, yet they still had the clarity, and I attribute that just to them being great guitar players. James Hetfield is a phenomenal rhythm guitarist. A lot of people playing that style of music, if you're a lot modern guitar players were to play that through the vintage recording techniques they were using back then, I doubt it would sound as polished as what James played.
Yeah.
So it still had this raw energy, man, to that album. That album specifically, you could hear the bass and drums a little better than the prior album. So they brought the low end. So I think the recording techniques themselves probably didn't change much from the vintagey styles, but I think maybe it was just mixed a little bit better, in the post production part of that.
Well, getting into the 80s, you had the advent of the SSL console. and that was a huge uh, game changer in recording technology. You know, SSL, solid state logic, is one of the probably most recognizable, you know, mixing consoles that you see in many pictures, right? But when working on an SSL, they had this thing called a bus compressor. This was the first iteration of using a compressor on the entire mix, right? And this bus compressor was so well regarded. This is like the epitome of all the rock records in the 80s. That big, thick, giant sound that comes from that.
Oh yeah.
You know, and Metallica absolutely utilized that, you know, and we are hearing that difference from when it was from Ride the Lightning into that, you know, more saturation out of the guitars, right? You know, and one of the things, guys, this is the thing about like working with guitars, the real thing. It's really hard to emulate in software that compression and drive that comes out of the actual guitar cabinet. This is why a lot of modern recording studios, they still prefer to record the actual guitar cabinet and just crank it to quote unquote 11, right? You know, Spinal Tap there. But we have in that recording process, you have, you know, the preamp gain where you could add, you know, pre-distortion and all that stuff. And then you also have the power tubes coming out of the guitar amp, which is like raw saturation. You got to play that loud in order to really get that going. And it's just, that's, you know, a lot of people, they say, you know, they love the plugins and stuff, and the plugins are great, but the plugins at best emulate, you know, the preamp section and part of the power tube, but not so much that compression and drive that you get, because that actually has to push air, right? This is, that part of it requires physical air. You know, going into Metallica and, you know, working with those Marshall amplifiers and Kirk Hammett and, you know, James Hetfield, these guys are, you know, phenomenal players, right? Which is also a big thing, right? You got to play it. You got to play it right. You know, you know, this was revolutionary by implementing that with something like the SSL, and going forward, you know, you got stuff like Megadeth, you know, and the difference between playing, you know, like a Peace Sells album or Rust in Peace into, you know, something like a modern like album like Dystopia, or even United Abominations. Even, you know, you can go into that realm of Megadeth.
Great album, by the way.
Yeah, Sleepwalker. You know,
that's awesome. You know, you bring up Megadeth though. That's interesting because, you know, I think their sound was even more unpolished than Metallica. But I think I attribute that to Dave starting Megadeth out of just pure anger and revenge.
Oh, totally,
like,
dude.
all right, they kicked me out of my own band. I'll show them. You know what I mean?
That's exactly what it was. That's exactly what it was. I mean, you know, watch an interview of Dave Mustaine talking about it, and you just see the come out of
it's
him.
Emotional.
It's emotional. I mean, but you know, you're talking about like probably one of the biggest metal bands in history, like kicking you out, and it's like, I feel pretty dirty about it too, you know. But you know, to his credit, he said, okay, well, I'm going to take it into my own hands, and I'm going to start Megadeth, and he's part of one of the big four. You know, that's quite an accomplishment. He's been in two of the big four of those bands. You know,
I would say there's a life lesson there too, for everyone watching and everyone who's going to watch this later. Is, you know, think about, you know, starting a band, starting your biggest passion in life. You're doing it, and then it just not only does it not work out, it just goes to complete shit. You know, you're kicked out of your own band. Most people, I'd say 90% of people, would just kind of give up, go a new direction, and just be pissed off for the rest of their life. But Dave made a choice to, it's like, no, I'm not going to let that happen. I'm still going to do what I'm called to do. I'm still going to push. So I think that one of the, you know, and what is one of the things we want to give you guys here on the Metal Mastermind show is that, you know, don't let anything, don't let anything drag you down and stop you from pursuing what you want to do with your life. You know, pursue it like your life depends on it, because it kind of does in a sense. You can go through life, just like, well, I'm just going to go with the flow and do what everybody else is doing, go get the regular job, and nothing wrong with that, guys. I'm not saying, I'm not saying go quit your job, but and you just kind of give up on life when you've got this big dream that's just sitting in the pit of your stomach, and you need to do something with it, but most people don't. So just let that be that lesson what Dave Mustaine went through. He easily could have just gotten strung out on drugs the rest of his life, which I think he kind of did anyway. But he still continued to pursue his dream. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
don't let anything stop you guys. Don't let anything stop you from pursuing what you need to be doing with your life. Just make it happen. Go out there, get pissed off if you have to, whatever it takes to make that happen. So I just kind of want to interject that right there,
Yeah.
because Dave is a perfect example of
Yeah,
that.
it was a blessing in disguise for him, you know. I mean, yeah, he didn't get to play in Metallica anymore, but yeah, he went on to create one of the biggest metal bands in history as well. That was, you can argue, is pretty much alongside that band. Maybe didn't make as much money, but is certainly as well known as Metallica, And I gotta say, man, Dave Mustaine is one of my heroes for that. Yeah, he's got his own quirks and stuff like that. Or, you could question those methods, but he's
Yeah.
a success, and he's an inspiration like no other. I can't really compare Dave Mustaine to anybody else. He's his own kind
You
of
can't, no.
person, and I respect that a lot about him. And that being said, all of the bands that these guys have influenced, right? Let's go a little bit further, closer to 2020 now. Let's talk about someone like Killswitch Engage, or a band like Killswitch Engage.
Yeah.
That type of guitar tone, super modern guitar tone, guys. This is like,
Extreme modern, dude,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. Yeah? Now, Jason, like, describe to me like that kind of tone, that timbre, that color that we're talking about here, in comparison to something like we hear in Metallica.
I think Killswitch Engage's tone specifically, Adam and don't remember the other guitar player's name. I'm bad with names, but I think their tone is one of those tones. The first time you hear it, you're like, oh my God, that's the tone. You hear that, you're like, holy crap, I've got to get that tone. There's this kind of like chunkiness to it, but a smoothness to it, if that
Mhm.
makes sense. And then the
Absolutely.
chunkiness I attribute to their lower tunings that they use for Killswitch's songs. But there's this just like really, it's polished, but it still sounds really good to the ears. And the other thing about it is it mixes well with everything else that is going on. So when they came out with when I first heard them, like, many years ago, and of course their tones kind of gotten even more polished over the years, I was like, holy crap, I've never heard anything like this before. Now, of course, like we talked about, every other band sounds like that. If you listen to most other guitar tones, they're very similar to, it's kind of like Ken. It's kind of like Eddie Vedder's voice. And no, I was not a fan of the '90s and all that whole thing. But it's like when Eddie Vedder came out, and much respect to him as a singer, but every other band started having that Eddie Vedder voice to them.
Yeah.
Every band. I mean, and it was that. So the same thing happened here with Killswitch. I think they came out with that, and it became a sought after tone. Whereas back in the day, I don't know that people obsessed that much over tone when it came to metal. Yeah, to an extent, that they cared about it, but I think it was more like we want our own sound. Whereas today, with Killswitch and these other bands, it's like, okay, if the tone doesn't sound like that, then we've got to fix that, right?
Right. Yeah, you make a great point, because a lot of the things that have attributed to the current situation in the music industry is oversaturation, right? Of just
Very much.
everybody wanting to do the same thing, and
Yeah.
that it makes it sort of like a needle in a haystack scenario, where it's like, how can you be different in a world of copycats, and
Yeah.
everybody's seeking after those tones, which, by the way, there's a reason, there's a good reason why they want that tone. But at the same
Oh, sure.
time, it's like, like, there's so many bands out there, like, right now, that, honestly, to be quite honest, I haven't really kept up with so much of the metal that's in the modern day and age. It's so hard, because it's
Yeah.
like there's so many bands here and there, and it's like almost like in pop music, where there's so many one-hit wonders, and it's like, how many one-hit wonders do I need to know? Like, how about I know what I know. I know the bands that I really love to listen to. They've stuck with me for so long, and they've had that, I guess you could call it like market share for a long time now, and that's why they're so prevalent. And it begs the question, like, how does one become so memorable, right, in a world where everybody's trying to do the same thing? And it's really hard to answer that question because there's so many things that have been done, and it's so, one of our mentors, Leah McHenry, she says, nothing new under the sun, right? And we're always trying to find our own way on doing something, but at some point, somebody's already sort of done that, right? And we need to find that thing that really distinguishes us from the rest of whoever's, making music out there. And then on top of that, you have to know how to like market that. And so tone and recording become a huge part of that. And I feel that there's actually a really, really great way into like trying to develop that tone on your own time. And that's one of the hooks that I want to give you guys at the end of all of this here, because this is going to help you into thinking about how you record your guitars and vocals and stuff like that. So stay tuned to the end of the episode to hear about that. But man, like another band like I really love, but at the same time has shown its own like color, Behemoth, bro. Behemoth. Like, I Loved You at Your Darkest, Behemoth. 2018 is such a powerful sounding album, and it's recognizably Behemoth. Like, you hear it and you know it's Behemoth. Very dark, it's got this underlying growl to it. The drums on that record, on almost every single Behemoth record, super compressed, like, you hear it and you feel all of that energy that's, with those blast beats are coming through. That low frequency energy is like pushing on your speakers. I love that about Behemoth. Like a lot of metal bands, I mean, like, for example, like Cryptopsy. Like, I've listened to Cryptopsy a bunch, and you listen to some of their earlier stuff, and it's like, holy crap, it's so fast. Like, this guy's a machine. But then sometimes you listen to it, and it's just like, you can't even understand what's being said or any of that sort. It's like, it's just like, and I'm like, okay, wow.
The Cookie Monster, Cookie Monster vocals.
But like, not even like Corpse Grinder. We're talking about, was it Worm? I think was the original Cryptopsy singer. And you have this guttural, but like undefinable like sound that it's arguably, probably it's really what Cryptopsy is known for, right? But then you have Cannibal Corpse, and you have Behemoth, and Cannibal Corpse these guys they set the trend for, they set the standard for gutturals and stuff like that. And you see Corpse Grinder's neck, like this guy,
he's got a thick neck, dude. Yeah.
It's like a block. There's nothing ain't going past that. But it's amazing that the sounds that these guys are creating, and how are we learning from that? How are we developing our sounds to be, is it better to go in that direction, or is it better to move forward, right? How do we decide what from vintage recording, right, that we like, that we think is worth keeping versus the modern stuff, I mean, like, Jason, when we're talking about vintage stuff, let's get into vintage for a second. A lot of the problems that come with vintage are very apparent in those recordings, right? Those recordings of, especially, let's go back to Sabbath and Priest, they had so many limitations on the hardware side, okay? Yeah. We're talking about in an age where nobody's ever heard a distorted guitar, and this is the first thing they hear, and they're like, what is that? What is that sound? It's it's the devil's work, that sort of thing, right? And Dio with the horns, but it's this is the sort of thing that when we're talking about vintage and modern recording, I mean, these guys were trying to figure it out, and they figured it out along the way. And you know, much respect to those guys, because think about it, like now you got like Rob Halford, you know, he's old, and
Love some Rob Halford, dude.
but at the same time, man, they're showing how being old as a metalhead. These are the first old metalheads, you know, that are really like coming into the fold now and showing how to live the rest of your days as a metalhead, you know, as a musician, which is awesome. I love that about them. But, you know, their recording technology was so limited back in that day that, you know, coming to all the tools that we have in today's world is, it's almost just laughable. Like, why would you want to go vintage in this sense? You know, whenever somebody's working with, let's say, like an EQ, right? For those of you who do not know, an equalizer is something that you know, engineers and musicians that we use in order to adjust frequency amplification. So, you know, if you want more treble, you want more bass, you use an EQ for that. But the parameters on an EQ back in the day were so limited. They didn't even have, some of them didn't even have the function to even choose like where you wanted to be EQing. It's like they only had one spot where you could boost or cut, you know, and that was just part of the limitations. Nowadays you can go like shaping it any way you want, really. There's no limit to that. And, you know, even other things like microphones. If you have microphones that, they're wonderful microphones, but also some of those studios maybe did not have the right microphones for the vocalist. They didn't have the right console for the record that they were trying to create, you know. All of these things, they play a part into all of that. And when we were talking about that versus modern recording, we have the accessibility of getting any sound that we want to on a whim. And
that's true.
There's a double-edged sword to that, which is like you have too many options and then you don't know which one to do.
I was going to say that. I was going to tell you that, like, you know, that's part of the, I guess, the downfalls of modern technology is it's easy to get overwhelmed. I know when I jumped into software recording, and I was just having this conversation with someone earlier this week that, because they said, man, I'm this guy's saying I'm 48 years old, and you know, I haven't recorded since the old days of having a standalone Tascam recorder, and I even had a
Gosh.
Fostex way back then. These are old machines, you know.
Fostex.
And then learning this new way of recording, yeah, it's a learning curve to that, and it can be quite frustrating. I almost gave up on it and bought a standalone recorder, went back to that. This is back in like 2009, 2010, as I was getting, you know, ready to start, you know, really, I'd been out of the music scene for a while at that point for a few years. So I'm like, I got to jump back in this. And so, yeah, it can be overwhelming with all the options. Another thing I want to point out here is, if you notice, a lot of the modern technology, they're trying to replicate vintage things, vintage hardware. So
Yes.
I think that right there kind of tells us something, that there's a sense that the vintage in some cases is, I don't want to say it's better, but it's more sought after, you know, and I think that is an attempt to get away from everything sounding the same.
Well,
Because
you
I
know,
think that's the risk
you
that we
make a
have
great point.
nowadays.
And here's the thing. Here's the difference, is that people love a lot of the tone that comes out of vintage equipment.
Yes.
And that's the wonderful thing. But people don't like the actual application of vintage equipment. Okay? Because it's like, you're like, try recording on tape. That's a pain in the ass. You know?
Couldn't even imagine.
Yeah,
I've never done it, but I couldn't imagine.
You know, I've done it before, and it's like, you know, you mess up, and then you have to literally rewind the tape. You have to splice it. There's so many things involved, and if you like one part of it and you don't like another part of it, you still have to redo it, you know, because it's like you got to get it all in one try. That's a pain in the butt, you know. And when we're talking, you know, getting into the modern side of things, it's like we love the sound of tape. Tape sounds great, but it sucks using it, you know. So we
Yeah.
always we have a lot of modern companies. You know, one example could be like Warm Audio that makes a lot of these vintage replicas, but with more modern functionality, and it makes it a
Right.
lot easier to use that kind of stuff. And I would argue at a lower price point, you know, since it's not what they're
That's
it's not the
good point.
original company one, right? That's one of the biggest
Yeah.
factors is that premium. It's like you buy Apple, but you're also buying the Apple premium when you get one of their computers, you know.
Right.
So same thing here. And a lot of those components, you know, they're cents on the dollar, you know. And it's just a matter of making them work in a way that, you know, help color the sound, and you're getting, you know, all these things. And I
Yeah.
want to say that a lot of the, you know, modern plugins that we have out there now. I mean, like I love plugins. I shop around for plugins all the time, and I'm looking at a lot of the things that we see out there for emulating a lot of the older style vintage equipment, and it's
Yeah.
amazing how close you can get to it. You know, there are a couple of companies out there that are doing this. Universal Audio, Antelope,
They're
Slate
huge, man.
Digital. These guys these guys are like wonderful at doing this kind of stuff. And websites like Plugin Alliance, Plugin Boutique, you can find a whole bunch of great sounding plugins that emulate a lot of the older style pieces of equipment, and pretty, you know, faithfully. I would say.
The same with guitars, you know, Ken. It's like I use Positive Grid's Bias FX and Bias Amp, their latest
Oh
versions.
yeah.
I have purchased their latest versions every time they've come out with them, and they're starting to get a little bigger of a company now. And sometimes we have a tendency to think, oh, we're starting to get big. I've got to find out, you know, something else. But uh, all that said, though, they haven't lost quality. You know, sometimes when companies grow, they go for the masses and the quality drops, but they've done a really good job at keeping up their quality. You know, their amps, there's a couple of amps for metal that I use. One in particular is this it's a simulator of the 5150. I think the
Nice.
original
The
5150 amp.
PV. Yep.
And then they also have a Celestion, they teamed up with Celestion and have a Celestion speaker, package that comes with that, and dude, that
Oh.
tone is phenomenal. I also use the Fortin amps by Neural DSP. One thing I'll say about tone, the guitar tone though, and this is really what I want guitar players to focus less on, is tone. A lot of the tone for guitar is right here, is in your hands, is in the way you play. And that's why even myself, I've played through different plugins. People are like, well, I can't tell that big of a difference. You look at people like Ola England, who's famous for playing through all these amps. And, you know, it's been said millions of times that, or countless times that, you know, Ola, all your amp sounds, they sound the same, even though he's playing through different amps. Now, if you were to put them side by side, you could tell the difference, but it's because that's the way he plays, you know. And when, as a guitarist, and I would say as really any musician, whether you're a vocalist or keyboard player, drummer, you know, your tone and what comes out is going to be based on really how much you've practiced your craft and how engaged you are in your own abilities in pushing that,
Yes.
more so than the product you're using. That product you're using to get that guitar tone or that vocal technique or whatever, you know, that should be an afterthought, in my opinion. You know, work on your skill set first. Don't expect the newest and greatest plugin to make your guitar sound awesome.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that's just a big thing I want to point out. And because, like you said, we can become very overwhelmed. I myself, we get like I stopped testing plugins. I just stopped, you know, because I would test them just to have some YouTube comment, and I'm like, I'm not going to do this anymore because I'm starting to not enjoy it, and all the plugins are kind of sounding the same. It's like there's nothing really new at this point. You know, they've gotten to the level where, okay, I don't know that it will get any better. And real quick, another thing I'll say is there are days where I get sick and tired of playing through plugins. So I plug in, which you guys can't see it, my EVH. I plug into my EVH amp and I'll crank that up in the studio a little bit. And when I go to that amp and just play, it always feels so much better playing through that amp than even the best plugin, you know? So that's just kind of a point to the equipment's important. I'm not knocking that. I'm not, you know, disregarding that. But what's more important than that, though, is work on you as a musician, as a singer first, you know, and
Absolutely.
make the song great rather than chasing that tone that you may find that tone one day, and you guitar players know this. You got a great tone, man. I dialed it in. It's the perfect tone. 2 days later, oh, I need a better tone. Nothing changed.
You know,
And you know,
I totally agree.
we all do it.
At the same token, it's like we're talking about, when I mentioned we were talking about tape, you had to get it right, and that's still true. You still need to get it right. The performance is the first thing, guys. The golden rules for recording. Here we go. Okay,
Let's hear it.
good performance,
Yes.
proper instrument, proper environment. Okay, proper microphone, proper placement of that microphone, and the proper preamp. Okay? All in order, by the way. Okay? The first thing, if you've never heard this term before, you can't polish a turd. Okay?
I love it, dude.
It's still turd. You know, you can shine it and it's still going to be a turd. Okay?
Yes, turd, yes.
So, polishing a turd is just, it's unacceptable. People hear it all the time, and people go through so much work in the mixing process to fix what was ultimately a bad performance. And, this is where we get overuse of auto-tune and all that kind of stuff. You guys all know all about that, right? Just listen to some of the modern bands doing that stuff, and you're just like, yeah, it's a bad performance. I can tell. and even though, because it's so computerized at that point, right? It's not even human anymore. So when we're listening to like a great performance, you almost don't need to do anything else after that if it was recorded properly, right? That's the only other aspect to that. Was it recorded properly, right? But the performance is there, right? You can get, you get a top tier classical violinist, right? That person's going to sound amazing on a cheap violin and a Stradivarius, right? And if you're going to get like a Stradivarius violin, which is like millions of dollars, right, on an amateur violinist, it's going to sound like crap, So you got to have the right performance and if you have the right instrument to go along with that, right, that's secondary, right? That tone, that comes after the performance, right? So you need to have first good performance, then you get the tone, right? And
that's why I tell my new guitar players, don't even worry about tone right now. When somebody's just starting out, they're like, Jason, man, I want that kill switch engage tone. I'm like, don't worry about it. You've probably got some amp emulator in your software, or use something cheap. Work on you first, get good, get awesome. Then you can start dialing in your tone.
Yeah. And here's a really cool trick for you guys. This is, part one of our giveaways here of knowledge.
Giveaway time.
Yes. We take a DI. What's a DI? A direct injection box, okay? Essentially what you do is you take a DI and you plug in your guitar to the DI. And on the throughput, you plug that into your amp, right? So now you have the ability to play on your amplifier as you normally would. But now you could record your amplifier, right, with a microphone, as you normally would have done it. And then out of the DI, there is an XLR, or microphone output, which goes into a preamp. And you could record your dry guitars, right? I urge you to do this so that when you are recording, and after the fact, if you're not satisfied with the tone, you could always take that recording, and if it was a good performance, you could re-amplify it later and put that on a different amp with a different setting, or the same amp and tweak the settings, right? And you can play around with the tone that way as well. Now, you could also argue the fact that, well, you're not feeling it in the moment, and that's a big part of it, A lot of the time, recording engineers, what they'll do is they'll record the DI track, and they'll record the raw amplifier with it. And what they'll do is most of the time that amplifier that's being recorded live is mostly for feedback for the guitarist, so that they could just play to that. But the DI could serve as an additional tonal color with reamplification of a different guitar cabinet, or with a modern sense, we could also add guitar plugins on that, right? And that will be in addition to the amplifier that you just recorded. So now you have a blend of many different tones that you can do. And of course, with plugins, you have a lot of different choices. And you can really fool around with that. If you really want to massage a tone into your record, that's one great way to do it. Because you have something that you're familiar with, right? And maybe that's kind of like a staple part of your sound, right? Depending on the EVH or Engel or Marshall, whatever you want, right? And then you combine that with something a little bit more eclectic, right? And you can get something unique that way. I'm a real big fan of recording in that sense, because it's now you have a lot of versatility to add to your arsenal here.
I like that a lot too, man, because I'll share this thing that I'm gonna do personally. You guys know I'm recording an album this year, an instrumental. Most of it's instrumental metal, but I plan to record my rhythm guitar tracks with a mic'd amp, and I don't plan to reamp it. I don't think I'm gonna use a direct box, or I think I'm just gonna really spend time, getting that good room tone that I need, and just go for it. You know what I mean? Because one thing about recording with a live amp, you have more pressure to play it right the first time than you do with a plug-in, because going back and forth pressing buttons when you're playing with that live amp mic, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more lively. So I
Yep.
plan to do the rhythm tracks with the old school way, just miking a Shure SM57 up to that amp. But however, the lead tracks, and I'm also going to have some ambient and clean tones as well. I'm leaning towards using plugins for those tracks. So this will give you a really nice blend of vintage and modern, coming together.
Yeah, absolutely. And Al Acoustic actually mentioned Joe Bonamassa, and when I teach at School of Audio Engineering Institute, I talk about Joe Bonamassa all the time
Yeah.
because I have actually a big picture of him in one of my slides, and you you see him with all his guitars and all his amplifiers, and he is always still talking about just play it right, damn it. So I love that about Joe, and he's a phenomenal player. One of my idols as well when it comes to guitar playing, alongside people like Petrucci and
Oh,
Satriani
dude,
and
yeah.
stuff like that. So
Huge
got a
Satch fan.
lot of respect for Joe, and man, like
Yeah.
taking it a step further, right? Let's talk about we've talked about guitars, but like vocals, man. Like some people get very fixated on the idea that oh, I need this expensive microphone because I think it's going to make it sound better. No, dude, like again, the performance is
Yeah.
the key thing. You get an SM58, something that you find on stage. You know who sings on an SM58 on their records? Bono.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize this
Bono
still.
from
Wow.
U2, right? If anybody remembers U2, okay?
Yeah.
Sings on an SM58 on his records, okay? He just likes that. He likes using a 58. It's got the sound that he needs, okay?
What a phenomenal voice too, though, dude. You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
that
you'd
that
almost
tells you a
think
lot. That
though that
tells you.
he's like using like some fancy $10,000 microphone, but he's not. He's
No.
not. He's using something very very practical. It's like
Yeah.
only $100. And here's the thing, uh, it's hard to find the right microphone. It's so hard to find the right microphone because there's so many out there, and you really have to just play with them in order to see
Yeah.
how it sounds. But not everybody's got the dough to shell out on doing something like that, right? And
Definitely.
not
Right
even
here.
yeah, and not every studio has the
Yeah.
resources to find the right microphone that works for you. So one of the
Right.
big things, here's another tip, right, that I really love doing is looking into something like a virtual microphone system, especially in your home studio, right? I've got one right here actually. I'm not using it at the moment, but I'll show you guys right here. Oh,
Yeah. I'm
this,
interested in this. I want to know more about
yeah,
this. You've mentioned this to me before, and I'm really curious about it.
this
While you're
microphone
setting that
right
up,
here.
Faceless mentioned something earlier. The Faceless mentioned on here in a comment that he was talking about a specific band, how he heard the album and the vocals were just superior and clean and all that good stuff, but then he heard them live and it was just crap, complete crap. So
Oh yeah,
that's another you never want to polish that turd, so to speak, so much in the studio that you can't reproduce that live, because that's really there's been other bands like that I've heard actually too, and it's like you go see them live, it's like, oh my god, is like this a new band, new singer? Like what happened? So yeah,
yeah,
that's a very good
absolutely.
point.
I'm really empathetic to that too because it's like sometimes you start out one way and it turns out to be something else at the end of it, and that's just because of maybe how you started it from the beginning in the get-go, and you have to rectify that. So doing it right from the beginning actually helps you in the long term, right? And speaking of which, this microphone right here, I love this mic. This comes from Antelope. I have good friends at Antelope, and they recommended this to me. And I was listening to how this mic sounded, and this is not a review of this mic at any means, but the wonderful thing about this is that I could actually choose emulations of many different other types of microphones out there. And I can say, if I have a singer in my studio one day who sounds great on one style of mic, I have the ability to switch that up with another singer another day without having to change the physical microphone. And that's because that this microphone itself is super clean, very linear, no color added whatsoever. All the color adds on the emulation side, that software side, right?
Wow.
And thank you for my shotgun microphone is also running through an Antelope interface, but I've got a whole other kind of thing going on with this shotgun microphone. But this microphone as well is really, really awesome in that regard. Thanks for that, Al Acoustic. I appreciate that. It does use phantom power, right? So this is a condenser microphone. And the beautiful thing about condenser microphones is that they're the most sensitive type of microphone. So it's very integral that the design of something like this is a condenser. It needs to be able to have the sensitivity to be able to emulate all the other types of microphones, because you could lower that in on the software side. You can lower the impedance, all the, we can talk about electricals and all that stuff all day, but you can really manipulate how that's going to sound if you have the reference as a super clean, super sensitive mic, right? This is not the Steven Slate mic. The Steven Slate mic is the ML1 that you get from Slate Digital. This is the Antelope Edge Duo.
What's the difference between those, though, Ken? Because I've heard, like, I didn't know about this Antelope stuff until you told me about it, and I've seen advertisements for the Slate digital mics. What's the difference between those two? Are they pretty much the same type of
So, great question. Antelope is a it was a company that was well known in the mastering world. Now, I used to intern at Masterdisc, which was in the city in New York City here, and we were always seeing Antelope, and it was known as a great clocking interface. And what they make now, they've kind of expanded their market. They're known for their clocks, so they have very accurate digital clocks on their devices that sync up everything to a point where it's like, wow, you could really hear the stereo image so much clearer, that kind of thing. But when working with their more consumer friendly or professional or prosumer kind of products, if you want to call it that, their interfaces, they're a little more of a premium, but they are fantastic in the way that they're super clean, right? And all of the stuff that Steven Slate has a very similar type of product. I think is this VRS, virtual recording studio,
something like that.
And it's essentially very similar to what Antelope does, but the difference is on the software side, right? So
Gotcha.
Antelope has a lot of high resolution, their own plugins, and this thing has what we call DSP, so digital signal processing, which can offload all the plugin information that I'm working with inside my DAW onto the interface so that I'm not bogging down my computer. Really powerful.
Cool.
Really powerful.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And on the fly, I could literally change the timbre of what I'm working with, right? Now, this unit itself, the microphone costs about $1,200. The interface itself costs about $1,200. So and if you get them in a package, I think it's they sell it for $2,000 or something of that sort. Now, the virtual microphone system that you get with Steven Slate, you're spending about $1,000 for the microphone, and I want to say it's roughly around another $1,000 if you wanted to get the VRS. But you can use VMS, which is the virtual microphone system, the $1,000 option, you could use that with an existing setup, right? Now, the reason why I got the Antelope was 'cause I was in the middle of upgrading my interfaces anyway. So I figured, let me get a better interface that has the capability of what I want. So that was a smarter choice for me. It might not be for other people. There are other reasons to go with Slate. There are other reasons to go with Universal Audio. But these sorts of devices provide a ton of versatility. And that's the key point about getting something like this, is that you want to be able to have the flexibility to pull what you need from it when you need it, right? So,
You know,
right,
especially if you're recording other people, right? If you're recording other
absolutely.
people, this is like if you have a little studio and that's what you do, you're recording different bands. That's probably perfect because you do need the different setup. But real quick, like what would you? And this is interesting because a lot of people don't have the budget for that sort of thing, and a lot of people may only be concerned about just recording their
Sure.
own stuff where they don't need all the versatility. Would you recommend going back to some of the old school mics? I mean, I sing death metal through my Shure SM7B right here, and I was very happy with it. But
Oh, yeah.
now will I use that again? I don't know. But what I guess with a vintage mic, or I don't know if it's considered vintage, but with the SM 58 or even this thing here, are there some plugins that are in more of a budget friendly zone for
Glad you
vocals?
asked that question, because
You know,
you can do so much in the DAW with using a
true, yeah,
regular mic as well, right? So, do you
yeah,
need a virtual microphone system? No, you don't, and you don't need all this stuff. But this is just the options of what are out there, right? And what's possible today, right? So, if you think about it, right, if you had a virtual microphone system, you would have the equivalent of having hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of microphones to choose from, right?
that's
So
crazy too. Yeah,
if you're looking for something as sort of a flexible tool that can emulate and do a lot of different types of routing, like right now I have a shotgun microphone that has some signal processing on my Antelope. It's
yeah,
going through Pro Tools and all that kind of stuff. But I could also switch over to this microphone, and I can use it for when I need it to do that, right? So now, as I'm a working audio engineer, so I need that flexibility. So it works
yeah. You
more
have to have
smartly
that.
for me. But for somebody who's just doing like their own thing, for their music, and they only need just vocals that are for that style, you could absolutely go ahead and use an SM7B. By the way, it's an amazing microphone. One of the singers from my other bands, it's called Four Trips Ahead. He uses that microphone, and he says, I don't use the very fancy ones because I sound better on the SM7.
I
Uh,
love this thing.
it,
Yeah,
it's a classic. It's a classic microphone. Red Hot Chili Peppers uses that microphone.
yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with doing any of that sort. So it's only whether what are you after? Are you after versatility? Are you after a very specific thing? And you have to define that when you make that purchase, right? So you could save a lot more money on doing something while getting like an SM7B, which is like a $200 to $300 microphone, versus getting
Yeah.
$1,000 microphone. But if you're only using it for that one thing, that's totally fine. You don't need anything else than that. So it's really, what do you want out of it? And we're just here to kind of give you that information as to what are the options, right? Versus, like, just think about it. Back in the day, you only had that option. If you
Yeah.
and if you
That
wanted
was
to
it. Yeah.
if you had a different style today than you did yesterday, you had to go and dig for that.
Yeah.
So it's a beautiful thing that we have something like this now. And that's the problem that I'm seeing. Al Acoustic, my Rode NT1A is too bright, need to get something new. That's one of the problems that we encounter when we buy microphones. It's like sometimes the microphone that we get is not the right microphone.
Yeah.
So
It has to cater to your voice too, and
it
same thing with guitar
does.
amps. I mean, your point about plugins, it's like, okay, well, if you're more of a versatile guitar player, and even myself, I'm recording some different projects right now, so I'm using plugins for that because I don't necessarily have the funds to buy a Mesa Boogie, my EVH, a Fender clean amp, a Marshall, this, that, and the other. You know what I mean? I don't have the means to have a room full of different kind of amps that for
Right.
those different styles. So it kind of goes back to these plugins and modern technology giving you the extreme flexibility. This mic stuff you're talking about is just amazing, though. Like I knew it existed, but you and I talked about it, and you went into some more in depth, and especially now, it's like, wow, that's ridiculous, you know?
Well, yeah, I mean, the question is, who is it for, right? And it's for
Yeah.
the modern musician who wants to have expandability
Yeah.
in their home studio. This is for the home studio. That's really who it's for. Recording studios that are still out there right now. God bless them. I hope that they're like doing okay during this crazy time in the world. But
Yeah, dude. Yeah.
those studios, they have their collection of microphones, right? And you go to a
Right.
specific studio because they have a certain sound.
Yeah.
So they don't have to worry about this kind of stuff. But the people at home, they can utilize this to help enhance something that they got going on that could match quite literally very well to those studios.
Oh, yeah.
And the only other factor to that, honestly, is acoustics. How well do you have your room treated? Is it serving the recording? And that, because that's one of the parts of the golden rule, right? The proper environment. Okay, so you need to have the right acoustics in order to record something correctly. And if you have a untreated room, it's going to sound very echoey, a lot of slap back within the walls, that sort of thing, and it's not going to serve the recording as it needs to be, right? So that's one of the other challenges, right? Where you can sometimes, especially let's talk about like guitars for a second. When you're recording a DI, you're taking acoustics out of the equation. You don't need acoustics when you record DI. It's a direct signal, and you're reamping the guitar within the software. So you have a perfect sound. Maybe you're not getting the compression and drive like you get with your amplifier, but you get close, And the other side is, well, maybe you put the guitar amplifier, if you're recording the actual amplifier, you put it in a certain spot in the room, and it sounds better in that part of the room, and it makes that sound even bigger than what it could have been in that amplifier. So you got, it's this double-edged sword that we keep talking about, where modern and vintage, it's like there's not any one way I think where you should go. I think there should always be a blend. There are some things that we have to learn from acoustic principles that come from vintage, right? From the pioneers of who made this stuff. And then you have the enhancements that are meant to kind of elevate what's being done here, right? So you take the principles of what we talked about of, with the golden rules, right? So we have good performance, right? Good instrument or proper instrument, proper environment, proper microphone. Then you have the proper placement of that microphone, and then you have the proper preamplifier, okay? You take those 6 elements and you do those right, you're golden, literally. So that's what we have to always walk away with. It's not about the gear, it's the ear. So work with that kind of philosophy, and that will help you into achieving something that you're looking after. Let's do we have any other parts we want to kind of add to this, brother? You want to start answering some
questions here? I want to just I'm just kind of scrolling through to see, does anybody have any questions for us? Like, I mean, we've had a lot of good things come up from you guys, but is there any specific things that you guys have for us as far as like vintage versus modern goes?
Well, I see a question here from Faceless. I'm only recording using plugins in my home setup, so no treating required, right? So this is where I'd say you'll always need some sort of treatment, okay? Because as you're hearing, I mean, unless you're only working on headphones, if you're hearing on speakers, which I highly encourage, it's a different experience, right, than headphones.
Yeah, definitely.
You want to have some treatment in your room. That way you are taming the echoes inside the room so that you're hearing your speakers more clearly, okay? Because a lot of the time when you factor in, example, like distance, right? Because you're not having your cans right here like you are with headphones. That's the difference between speakers and headphones. You actually feel air being hitting you, right? So now that you have distance, you also have reflections in the room that you have to account for. Now, in an ideal world, the perfect studio is in an open field because there's no walls, right? But we can't do that. We need electricity. We need walls to keep us safe from the rain, and it's all that stuff. So we can't do that. But we have to at least tailor a little bit to that, right? Now, do you need to build a floating room that's isolated from the world? No, you don't need to do that. But what I like to do is create just a little bit of treatment to make a listening environment that's as close as I can get it. And then from there, what I do is I implement calibration technology to make sure that I'm making sure that my speakers are responding to the room the way it needs to be, so that when I'm listening to it, it's more accurate to
That's a
what's
great
actually being
point. That's
done.
a really good point,
Right?
man.
But it first comes with the room. You know, you need to do the
Yeah.
room. The calibration won't do anything if you got reflections in your room that are interfering with how you hear. So you want to make sure, and if you have a very big room, it becomes even more important, because now you have a lot more space, a lot more reflections that can come and hit
Yeah.
back, right? So that sort of thing. We have any
I'll say a
other?
poor
Yep.
I'll say a poor man's way of too of doing this. Like if you're really strapped for cash, and I know sometimes a lot of you are, especially during all the events we've had going on lately. Some of you may have lost your job or whatever. One of the things you can do, and one of the things I've done in a small room, is you can just have some small pieces of furniture there, cloth furniture that will help absorb some of the sound. That's not ideal, I know. I'll be honest with you guys. Like in the room you see now, I don't have any acoustic treatment at all. But one thing I will say that I do is I've been using the same monitors for 10 years now, and what's happened is my ears have become so accustomed to what comes out of those monitors and the same setup is I've kind of adjusted the way I hear my mixes, and all, from just that consistency. So on that note, what I'll say, if what you're hearing isn't what you expect to hear, or you think your mixing is
One
bad,
second.
don't go out and automatically buy a new pair of monitors. What I would say to that is, first try to set your room up in a way to where you can get a good mix. Especially if you're doing that, if you're going to do that part of your whether you're releasing a single or an album or whatever, you know, make sure you've spent enough time with those monitors, because a lot of times it's not going to be the actual monitor, because monitors are like mics and amps and everything else. You've got cheap ones, you've got great ones. I don't know that there are any monitors out there that's over the $300 mark that suck. You know what I mean? It's going to be some are decent, they're usable. Others are just really expensive and more prestigious, but you still have to have that room treatment. But again, back to my
Yes.
point from my personal perspective is I've been consistently using the same thing for a long time in the same area, same setup. So I have kind of trained my ears to become accustomed to what's coming out and how those frequencies are responding in my specific setup. Now, if I went to a different room, I would have to kind of start from scratch again. So that's just another thing. I do recommend getting wall treatment, and that's something I'm looking into, Ken, here pretty soon. Here is getting some treatment on the walls here.
You know, you make a great point, because one of the best ways to learn about how your room sounds is to listen to music that you're very familiar with,
Yeah.
and just listen for a long time and listen to how the room reacts to the music as you are playing it through your speakers. Um, and then when you are trying to emulate that in your mixes, you can kind of get a ballpark of where things are, right? So that's one of the telltale signs of how to mix in a room that you're unfamiliar with. Just listen, bring a couple reference tracks, listen to those reference tracks, and make sure that you are hearing what you're supposed to hear. And if you're not hearing certain things, well, you're more aware of that, right? Now, adding room treatment will always be something that can be that will always have some cost. Now, I see some of you have made your own room treatment, which I have done myself. I love doing
There you
that.
go.
It's a fun project to do. You go to Home Depot, you get some rock wool, and you get some canvas, and you tie it together, staple gun, some panels, and you make them yourself, and you can do it for quite a low cost. It's actually a great way to go. I mean, there's more manual labor, right? If you're not into doing the manual labor, you can buy it, but then that's what you're paying for. You're paying for that manual labor of it being done. But doing it yourself, it's very, very easy to do. And you just get a couple of the right materials, or if you get fiberglass, that's another way to also do it. You just got to be a little bit careful with managing the material, because fiberglass get very itchy, very, very itchy.
Oh, yes, dude.
But I want to make a reference one of your points. You said adding furniture. When I was at that mastering studio, I swear, man, that mastering engineer, he said, the best part of this studio is that couch. Because he was like, that couch is the best bass
Yeah.
trap in this whole room. And I said, wow, that's cool. So adding furniture does so much. It actually
Yeah.
does. Like, think about it whenever you've moved into a new space and then you put in a bed in that space and how much already like the reflections of the room kind of went away. And that's because that bed acts as an absorber. It's just
Yeah.
soaking in all the sound whenever it's reflecting back and forth. So it's kind of an interesting thing, but it's a very true scenario. Let's see. You can always hang blankets when you sing. Doesn't cost anything. That's just true. You can use blankets, although blankets they do have limitations, right? You have to be able to put them in the right spots. Not everybody has a small confined space. Also, here's the thing: all frequencies don't respond to the same materials the
Mm.
same way. Okay,
That's a
so
good
a lot
point,
of
dude. That's a
people,
very good point.
they'll take it, they'll go into like let's say a closet, and that's where they'll do um,
Yeah.
their recording, and they'll say, okay, yeah, this is my studio booth. But when you walk into that closet, listen to how maybe the bass kind of sounds versus the high frequencies, right? All the sibilants, right? Yeah, the sibilants and the consonants of your voice, they get more absorbed. So it sounds a lot drier in that frequency. But with the bass frequencies, it actually sounds boomier in those closet rooms because those frequencies, they're so long that they constantly come back and forth. It's very hard to get rid of bass unless you have a bigger room, right? So you want to make sure that when you're working with that sort of thing, you have. That's why vocal booths are not like just quote unquote like so tiny. They have a little bit of give. They have some room. One for claustrophobia. Two is because you want to be able to have that acoustic balance out. Let's see here. Is it bright? Does it echo? Yep, that's one way to tell if you're hearing any echoes. You just clap your hands. Definitely, you'll hear the flutter. Um, my walls are sound treated to stop sounds from the neighbors. That works great. But then the walls are finished with plasterboard, so having some panels would be beneficial. Yeah, plaster is much more reflective. You just hang a couple of, even like having curtains really helps to stop some of those reflections. But it's not going to stop low frequencies. So the way you stop low frequencies is by putting bass traps. And low
Yeah. The bass
frequencies
traps. Yeah.
like to reflect into the corners, and that's where they get much more amplified. So having bass traps in the corners really helps. Um, yeah, and this is great. I'm really glad you guys are asking these questions. These are great
It's
questions,
good stuff.
and we have so much more to talk about on this subject. We could talk all day about this. Jay, how you feeling, man?
I feel good, dude. This is there's been a lot of good conversation here, and want to thank everyone, for coming on. And by the way, uh, there's a lot to learn here. There's a lot to soak in. As we're talking about, frequencies soaking into cushions and stuff. I always throw in the pun, but no, it's this is a great topic, and it's so relevant to all of us because this is how we record. The days and nothing against going to a big studio. If you have a budget for that, hey, that's amazing. But I think most of us, even myself, I would much rather just record my music right here in my home studio. And even if you're not doing this professionally, it's so inexpensive to get the technology needed to record your own music, and it's even more inexpensive to use some of the vintage as well if you're recording a specific style of music, like let's just say metal, for example, because I think that's why most of you are on here, because we're metal heads. You can get one amp, you can get one metal amp, that's all you need. It's going to do the trick. Go buy a used 5150 or something like that. Those are 6505, those are cheap. um, Plugins are cheap. You can mix and match those. There you're set. Get an SM7B mic or SM58 to record your vocals if that's what you're doing. Or if you want the other options, they're out there. Like Ken was talking about these mics, the mic simulations earlier with the Antelope. So, you've got like the entire world is of music is available to you. It's just a matter of, how much time you want to put in learning this stuff, what your budget is, and what you need. One thing I will say is don't overstretch yourself. Be conscious of your budget and be conscious of only getting what you need for your specific purpose, because like we talked about over and over, nothing's going to mask a bad performance. You know what I mean? No plugin is going to make you sound, awesome if you don't sound awesome already. So spend more time in practicing your craft. You know what I mean? Spend more time. Most of you on here, I think, right now listening are guitar players. But if you're a singer or drummer or whatever, spend your focus on that. And then, Ken went through those six, and I think it was six steps, Ken, six things you need. And that first in order was the most important, your performance, right?
Yep.
Don't think that a plugin's going to magically make you sound better. It's not. All right. And then, you do need the right gear, but all that comes later, but
Yes.
know what you need for your specific purpose. Don't go out and try to buy everything thinking that that's going to fix all your problems. Know the gear you need and just go down one by one. It's like, okay, I know I'm playing guitar. I want to mix modern and vintage. So let me find a good metal plugin. I'll ask Ken and Jason, what's a good metal plugin? And of course, we'll tell you. And I know I need a metal amp if you want to mix the two. Same thing with vocals. You know what I mean? Man, if you're a death metal singer, this Shure SM7B is going to work out quite well. You know what I mean? So, and I even use this for clean vocals too. So anyway, but that's no, I really, Ken and I, we were looking so forward to this week, man. Because we've been talking about it all week as we've been planning this session. And I hope you guys get some value. I know you got some value out of it because I see the comments here. And it looks like Acoustic got some value out of Ken's beard. I guess I need to grow my beard back long. Oh, dude.
This is a wonderful thing, because this is a conversation. This is essentially like the coffee shop. Where we're here, we're talking
Yeah.
over the table, and just having an honest conversation about what do you need as a musician, right? And what serves your needs, what's out there, what are the options. That's what we're here to try and do. And you got two different perspectives here. You got the recording engineer and the musician, just trying to help bring to life, your vision. That's what Metal Mastermind's all about. It's making it better and more efficient for you with the knowledge at hand. You come on. That's why we do this live, so that we can answer your questions right on the bat. We value that stuff, and it makes it a little bit more authentic to us as well. So we love this part of it, and
That's
we
awesome.
we appreciate you guys spending the time. I mean, I see a consistent amount of viewers on this, man. This is great, and we love having people here taking time out of their day to educate themselves on something that most people, they wouldn't do. That's why you're here. So that we love that. So guys, make sure that you subscribe if you haven't already.
Yes,
Like
please
this
do.
video. It really does help us out, so that people are able to hear more and spread the word. And we'll be doing this on a weekly basis. We'll see you guys same time, same place on Wednesdays at 12.
Yeah.
This is the Metal Mastermind, folks. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.